Over the last few interviews, we've covered my trajectory from being at art school and then developing a philosophical understanding that when I read the sonnets in 1995, all of a sudden I realised that there was this incredible philosophy embedded in the sonnets. And it took me quite a while to tease out all the elements of it. So I think it's time now to begin to look at the 1609 edition and to begin to explain what it was that I was seeing and why I feel there's such an amazing philosophical structure purposefully embedded by Shakespeare in there to present the philosophy behind all his plays, which is basically the 1603 folio of plays, 36 plays, also organised by him into comedies, histories and tragedies for a particular purpose. So coming back to the sonnets, by 1609, which is about 20 years after Shakespeare started writing his plays, he had been writing sonnets, as we know, in various plays, but it seems as if he intentionally, in 1609, published a set of sonnets, 154 sonnets, to present the philosophy behind all his works. Using that philosophy is the only way that I find I can see any consistency of understanding when I consider his plays. So the book that was published in 1609 was Shakespeare's Sonnets, never before imprinted, and presented by G.L. Petiti and sold at Church Gate, for instance. So that's the title page. And then there's a dedication to T.T., it seems, to the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, before you get to the first page of Sonnets. Now this is a facsimile of Shakespeare's sonnets, and the original sonnets do exist. There's at least 13 copies still in existence, and so we do have the absolute original 1609 sonnets in their organisation, in their spelling and in their wording, to guide us to be able to sort of be reasonably confident that what we're seeing is actually there. So as we move on, we will consider some of the elements of the philosophy. In Shakespeare's day, or before Shakespeare's day, there's what was called a sonnet vogue. And so the Shakespeare sonnets are seen to be something in that tradition. His sonnets were published in 1609, which is probably towards the end of that vogue, when most of the sonnets were published in the late 15th century. So when we look at his set of sonnets, one of the unusual or unique aspects of it is that there are two sequences. There's a sequence to a male and a sequence to a female. Most of the other sequences, just about all the other sequences in fact, were dedicated to a female or to a male, and that person was the focus of the sonnets right from the beginning right through to the end. And there was either love sonnets or laments or complaints in various forms, or they had religious pretexts. But those things are absent from Shakespeare's sonnets, and so what we find is there is this quite amazing division in the sonnets. And so you go from the first sonnet through to sonnet 126, which is the 12-line sonnet, and that's the end of the sequence to the male, and then the big sequence to the female begins at sonnet 127 and goes through to sonnet 154. So we find there are 126 sonnets dedicated to a male and 28 sonnets dedicated to a female. So why is Shakespeare in 1609, uniquely or differently from everybody else, talking to a male first and then to a female? It seems like there's some elementary structural in that decision that might reveal something of what his thinking is. So what we find when we look a bit more closely at the complete volume, the 1609 edition, is that not only is there a structure, apparently, in which there is a relationship between the male and the female, which each of the male and the female gets a separate sequence. When you look a bit more closely, and this is looking at the general patterns in the sonnets, you find that every 12th sonnet appears at the top of a page. So sonnet 12 and onwards appears at the top of a page. And there are 12 sets of 12 sonnets fitting within the sequence of 154. Not only that, if you consider sonnet 45, which talks about music, and Sonnet 8, which also talks about music. You'll notice there's a pattern in the sonnets in which there's a set of 8 by number of 8 sonnets throughout the set, going from the first sonnet to the 154th. So the closer you look, the more and more it seems that the edition that Shakespeare put together in 1609 has got quite a bit of deliberate structuring in it. And one of the problems that you find with contemporary editions of the sonnets, or even any other edition of the sonnets, in which, for instance, they might be presented 2 per page, then that structure is voided. You no longer see that structure. And so the original edition of the sonnets and the way they're organised on the page is critical for understanding what I claim to be the philosophy that's embedded in the sonnets. And there is a time that Shakespeare was also aware of the numerological structures that poets would embed in their sonnets. And it seems as he took that numerological structure and took it to a philosophical level, where he uses the 154 sonnets, the 126 sonnets to the male and the 28 sonnets to the mistress, to structure his philosophy. And that's the overall structure of the sonnets. So when we come to look at the large chart, we'll be seeing the overall structure of the sonnets, but only in later sessions will we begin to consider some of the sonnets in detail. We were talking about the large chart, and this is a chart that I prepared for lectures quite a number of years ago, and it shows the overall structuring of the sonnets. If you're in a lecture situation, of course, you won't be able to see the individual wording, but if you go up close, the sonnets are presented in the same size as they are in the original 1609 edition, so you can actually read the words. But as I say, the purpose really is to present the structure. So if we move over to the top left, we can see that there's the title page and there's the dedication, and you can see the words nature, poet, female and male around the dedication. And we won't be talking about that at the moment, but the dedication is organised to represent the basic structure of the sonnets, and I can show you that later on. And if we move across to what is called the increase sonnets, or the increase argument, there are 14 sonnets purposely dedicated to the idea of increase. They begin with the word increase and they end with the words truth and beauty. But before Shakespeare moves on to truth and beauty as we move across, he then takes into account what it means for him to be writing poetry about something like increase, which is a bodily function. And so he spends 5 sonnets talking about the transition from the body to the mind. And so when he mentions truth and beauty in the last of the increase sonnets, he talks about truth and beauty in those sonnets before he then moves on to the use sequence. And as we move across to the right, we can see that truth and beauty then becomes the function or the focus of all the sonnets from sonnet 20 through to 126, where Shakespeare discusses what truth and beauty, or what using language and what it means to express ourselves in art, what that means for his level of understanding, or what it means for any human being to have that capacity to be able to do that. In amongst all that, we see 9 sonnets dedicated to the rival poets, which are marked out in a light blue. And that sequence of 9 sonnets relates directly to the numbering, as we will see eventually, of the male in the sequence. And they are rival poets because they have a lesser function or a lesser capacity than Shakespeare to understand the philosophy. So if we move from there down to what is then the beginning of the mistress sequence, what we find in the mistress sequence from sonnet 127 onwards is that there are a number of sonnets through to sonnet 137 that mention only the concept of beauty, and which is, in the way they're discussed in those sonnets, is the idea of incoming sensations. And then coming over to the bottom left of the charts, we notice that last set of sonnets, or the next set of sonnets in the mistress sequence, only talks about truth, which is language. And so Shakespeare moves from talking about incoming sensations to the idea of language. And then he rounds out the set of sonnets with 2 erotic sonnets. And there's a purpose behind that, which we can come to later. But they're also part of the mistress sequence. So if we have been watching, we will see that the numbering of the sonnets, 154 sonnets in total, 126 sonnets to the male and 28 sonnets to the mistress. And the numerological system used in Shakespeare's day add up to either a unity or one short of unity. And that is intentional, and it shows that nature is a unity, that mistress is a unity, and the male as a offshoot of the female lacks a unity and needs to return to her according to the increase argument to continue the species. When we were out in the study, we were considering the original volume that Shakespeare published in 1609 to present his philosophy, as I claim, in the sonnets, called Shakespeare's Sonnets. We were looking at how that it was structured into a male and a female sequence, and we're beginning to talk about some of the minor or structural elements that are lost if there's any attempt to edit, amend, or rearrange the sonnets. Now that we're inside, we can see, looking at the chart behind me, that I made for lectures a little while ago, that it's possible to illustrate what the structuring of the sonnets is in terms of nature and the male and the female and the other elements of truth and beauty, for instance. Over the next little while, we will consider in greater depth these structural elements and show that they all contribute to the philosophy that Shakespeare articulates in the sonnets for the philosophy, or as the philosophy we live by, whether we think we do or not.